Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our time of reflection together. I'm glad that you're with us. You're joining me in some time of reflection. As always, we are going to continue with our reading of Kitchen Table Wisdom. Hope you can see that here on the screen. This is a collection of stories written by Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. And for each week, we've been looking at different sections. She breaks up the stories in her book, kind of giving them different sections. So this is a section called Knowing God. And the story that we are going to read together is What If God Blinks? What if God blinks? So follow along. And then we'll spend some time reflecting on the story. When I was small, God was still discussed in the public schools. I remember one assembly in which our principal, a fundamentalist, delivered a fire and brimstone kind of sermon to the entire grammar school. She read a passage from the Bible to us and told us it was important that we kneel and pray 3 times a day because we needed to remind God that we were there. Thinking back, she may not have said this in so many words, but this is what I took away. You prayed because you had to make him look at you. If God turned his face from you, she told the hushed assembly of children, you would wither up and die like an autumn leaf. And this part I am sure of. She actually held up a large, dried, and withered leaf. Even as a 5-year-old, it seemed to me that God had a lot of other things on his mind beside me. And in between the times that I was praying, he might blink. And then what would become of me? I remember the fear, the enormous terror. What if God blinks? I became so obsessed with this question, so fearful, I was unable to sleep. My parents were young socialists who considered religion to be, quote, the opiate of the masses, end quote. And my grandfather, who was a rabbi, was my only connection to a reality larger than social well-being and the class struggle. When I was this small, I actually thought of God as a friend of his, like the men who came over to smoke cigars and play gin rummy in our kitchen with my father. As these fears were not something I could discuss with my parents, I had to wait until my grandfather visited. It was probably only a few days, but I remember the waiting. I don't think you can feel such anguish and aloneness as an adult. You have to be very young. When I finally got my grandfather to myself, I told him what had happened. Shaking, I asked him the fearful question, what if God blinks? And at last my terror overwhelmed me, and I leaned against his shoulder and began to cry. My grandfather stroked my hair to comfort me. Despite his gentleness, he seemed distressed and even angry. But in his usual calm way, he answered my question with some questions of his own. Neshumale, he said. And by the way, for years I thought that my grandfather's name for me meant little Naomi. It actually means little soul. If you woke up in the night in your room, would you know if your mother and father had gone out and left you alone in the house? Still crying, I nodded yes. How would you know that? He asked. Would you see them and look at them? I shook my head no. Would you hear them? No. Could you touch them? By then I had stopped crying, and I remember puzzling over his questions because it seemed obvious to me that I would simply know that I wasn't alone in the house. I told him this, and he nodded pleased. Good, good. That's how God knows you're there. He doesn't need to look at you to know that you are there. He just knows. In just the same way you know that God is there. In just the same way you know that God is there. You just know that he is there, and you're not alone in the house. God's presence in the house is an inner experience that never changes. It's a relationship that's there all the time, even when we're not paying attention to it. Perhaps the infinite holds us to itself in the same way the earth does. Like gravity, if it ever stopped, we would know it instantly. but it never does. This inner knowing is a way in which I orient myself, an unfailing point of reference. Its effect on my life is as profound, as deep, as gravity's influence on my body. More than anything else, my sense of not being alone in the house has been what has allowed me to accompany people as they meet with pain, illness, and sometimes death. I know I say this probably each time that we read this story, or these stories, but I so appreciate the poignancy of each story that Dr. Remen writes, and just how eloquent they are, the ability to pack so much meaning into something so short is really remarkable. So what if God blinks? What did you think about it? I thought it was a really touching and moving story. I think that what's true about this story is that this isn't simply just a concern that 5-year-old Rachel has about, does God see us? Does God care about us? Are we in God's mind's eye or not? Is God protecting us? But this is a question that we actually ask all the days of our life, not simply just at 5 years old, but we probably ask this question in some version or not throughout our entire lives. I think what is a wonderful transformation that takes place in the story that she conveys to us is the transition between seeing God as a being that is predominantly about judgment and admonition and scalding you if you've done something wrong, punishing you in some way. Instead seeing God as a being who is there to create a relationship of love with, who cares for you, who's compassionate, who is a presence with you. I know for myself, that transition is one that is hard to make. I think many of us, I'll just speak for myself, grow up with a sense of God as a judge, and kind of God being someone who holds us to account for things that we've done wrong. But here, what we see in the story and what so many faith traditions from so many backgrounds and so many parts offer is that there's actually another way to view God. There's another way to enter into that relationship, and that is one through love and through compassion. I'm going to just look at a couple of lines here from the story that I wanted to just lift up again. I love that moment where she waits for her grandfather, waits for a chance to sit and talk with her grandfather, who's a rabbi. I wonder what he was like. Me being Jewish, I can imagine what that grandfather would say when he says, Nishamala, my sweetness, really my soul, my little soul. And I love his way of teaching her, even at 5 years old, the kind of image of if you awoke in the night, would you know that your parents were there? And that being the parallel for God knowing that you're there. As he says, he just knows, God just knows. In just the same way you know that God is there, you just know that he is there and you're not alone in the house. You're not alone. God just knows. And how often do we struggle with this sense of feeling that we are alone when what can be helpful to us, what we can know and at a deeper level, but sometimes might be hard to access, is that we're not alone, that God is with us. I think that another transition, kind of a flip from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, which I really love, is in the beginning of the story, right? The teacher in the school says, kind of gives this fire and brimstone sermon to the students that you need to pray 3 times a day because you need to remind God that you exist, that you're there, that you're thinking of God. And I think what the story does is it actually flips it around. What we need to do 3 times a day, or what we need to do during our days, is to remind ourselves that God is with us. Not that we need to remind God of our existence, but we need to remind ourselves of God's existence, of God's presence in our lives, that God is with us. This inner knowing, as Dr. Remen writes, is a way in which I orient myself as an unfailing point of reference. It's kind of like a guiding place within you, maybe a kind of a North Star, so to speak. She continues, its effect on my life is as profound, as deep as gravity's influence on my body, right? To such a deep core extent that we don't think about gravity. We just exist in a world with gravity. So too she's saying with God. More than anything else, my sense of not being alone in the house has been what has allowed me to accompany people as they meet with pain, illness, and sometimes death. And so that's the blessing that I wish for each of you, is that we are able to cultivate this sense of dwelling either in God's house or dwelling within ourselves, our own house, our own being, where we know that God is present, and that we know that we're not alone, that God is there with us, and that no matter what we are going through, we can hopefully cultivate a sense, an inner core sense within our own beings, within our own houses, of God's presence, being there with us in love and in compassion.